Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Expanding the Zone. I'm Shayne Combs of SVC Sports Zone and SVC Sports Talk, and I'm here as I always am with my brother Matt. And Matt, here we are, season 2 of Expanding the Zone. Last week we kind of had a little introduction, a little kickoff show, if you will, to get maybe a look back at our first season. And now we almost feel like this is our first real show of season 2, which would be our 32nd overall. And we always try to put a little title. Tonight we're going to have a little bit of fun. I think it's going to be a great show. It's records are meant to be broken, and the idea of the record discussion is we'll have fun with a lot of famous records throughout some of the highest level of sports. But as always, we're going to tie it into the high school game, and we're going to talk about how it influences some of our student athletes and we as coaches and leaders and our awareness of that. And anytime I prepare for one of these shows, I find myself looking at it, Matt, through the leadership or through the coaching lens. And I just got thinking today about expectation and guidelines. I just wondered what kind of comes through your mind when you think of setting some goals or setting some expectations or helping kids manage expectations that might be put on them from outside sources, in terms of, because sometimes I think what happens is, we set a bar maybe too low. We don't push our kids enough. But man, I see a lot of examples too where we set certain expectations that maybe aren't attainable, and we almost set kids up for failure. Just kind of as a hello introduction to the show here, to the fans. Use your 20 plus years of coaching experience and kind of talk me through what goes into you trying to help kids set a bar to best motivate them to be the best version of themselves.
Well, I mean, it can get a little bit tricky because I think sometimes kids or people in general maybe set their bars based on a certain, a number of wins, a number of points they're going to average, right? Or what's their batting average going to be? Or, I think sometimes that can be a little bit of a dangerous way to set expectations, just because you either sometimes maybe you set a bar too low. Sometimes maybe you're focusing on the wrong things with those types of things. But I think individual goals are okay. And I think we live in a time period where kids, let's be real honest, I mean, they're raised almost in sports to be individuals. I mean, I hate to say that. It happens at the younger levels. It happens in club and AAU type of sports. There is a little bit more of me in today's game, and you see it at the highest levels, and it filters down. But I think it's okay for kids to have individual goals, and I think as coaches we have to understand that they are going to have those, and like you said, try to help manage those. Is it okay for your best player to want to be all league or all district or all out? Yeah, I think so. That can be a goal. But again, what you're trying to help kids understand is to set these goals and try to attain them through the framework of what the team is trying to do. And I had a coach in high school that said this a lot, and he was right. I think individual recognition comes through team success, and that remains true today. You see it in a lot of, very seldom do you see, the district player of the year come off of a team that's, won 2 or 3 games all year. That's just not the way it works. It typically, you have to have some level of team success for individuals to be recognized. But I think that what we're going to talk about tonight, in some cases, are milestones or records or whatever. They are individual accomplishments. But I think sometimes maybe they sort of just happen, or maybe they become a goal as you get closer to that. I don't know, like if an incoming freshman at the high school level comes in with goals of breaking records, or, maybe some do. But I think as a coach, really what we're trying to do is, hey, it's okay to have individual goals. Nothing wrong with that. But just understand, we've got to do it with the team first, and the framework of the team first.
It's funny. It's funny you said it the way you did there about the player, because if you think back to your playing days, think back to you, Matt Combs, the teenager. You know, you're obviously a really, really good player, and you went on to do some special things as a player in high school. I view some of these records or milestones, or obviously milestones, because they're, you know, a rounded number or something like that. But even these records we're going to talk about throughout the show, maybe it's number of games of a hit streak or yardage or points or whatever it may be. Do you find, I guess a lot of times with expectations, the records set a bar, like, hey, I have to get here, this person has to get here. When you had an incredible work ethic in high school, at any point as a seventh grader, eighth grader, ninth grader, was there a number? Was there what ended up driving you and your, you know, in terms of your will to compete? Was it a milestone as 1,000 point score? Was it a school's all time leading score, a county all time leading score? Did any of that ever cross your mind as a teenager in terms of your will to just work at it?
It's an interesting question. I think again, it kind of comes with your age and how your progression or your development. I can remember thinking, "Hey, I just want to make varsity," and I can remember, okay, now I'm a varsity starter. I want to be all league. I wanted to accomplish, those things. I had those individual goals. I don't know, those milestones we're talking about tonight, like 1,000 points in basketball or your school's all-time leading score, anything like that. I think those things, for me at least, happened once they got closer to those things. You realize that, okay, there's a probability that this will happen, um, you know. And but for me, I was never motivated by a number or a milestone. To be honest with you, I mean that never caused me to go out in the driveway and take 100 extra shots. I mean, it just didn't. For me, it was about just being as good a player as I could be. I cared about my school and my teammates. I wanted to win. And really, so I was motivated more by that. But that's not really a credit to me. That was more of a credit to like my coaches in high school and the way I was raised. We just weren't taught to think about ourselves that much. It was more about what could we do for the group, and we had a close knit group, which caused you to want to be better for them. So I don't know that I personally was ever too motivated by, a number. I mean, obviously, when you get close to something like that, it's nice, and you want to go ahead and finish that and do that. But it was to me, it was never my number one motivation, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's some good stuff that I think young people can really learn from, and that progression in terms of how we change as players and so forth. You know, I kind of wanted to dive right into this particular thing. One of the topics I guess was on my mind for this evening was the time period. We talk about comparing errors. If we're at the higher levels, there's so much talk of a Jack versus Tiger, a LeBron versus Michael, all of those different things. Gretzky against the whole NHL history. Um, what to you? I just want to give you an open forum to start us here. What to you in terms of time period jumps out in terms of when we start comparing these errors? Because let's face it, records go generation to generation to generation, right? That there's these bars set, so it's impossible to have a talk like this without, like, when you start thinking of the time period, kind of give us an overview of that, and maybe even throw an example just to kind of get us rolling here tonight, as we're going to share a lot of records that are our favorites and time, into how we think leadership coaching, high school game, all applies to it.
Yeah, when you're comparing different generations, different time periods, I think it becomes difficult. I mean, obviously, it becomes difficult from a standpoint of, styles of play change, the game changes, whether it be in basketball, the 3-point shot becoming, more prevalent, or in football, it's really hard to compare a quarterback from
Mm.
yesteryear to now because of how much more you throw the ball. But then also, I think it's rule changes. I think rule changes are huge in
Mm.
making it difficult to compare eras, and especially when you're comparing milestones or records. I mean, let's look at the high school level just alone. We've talked about volleyball in the show before. Not even
Great
it's
example. Yeah.
two different games. I mean, you can't even compare a girl from 1988 to a girl from now in terms of records or numbers. It's not even close. It's gotten to the point where milestones like 1,000 assists. I mean, let's be real honest. In volleyball, if you start for 3 years, you're going to accidentally get 1,000 assists. I mean, it almost. I mean, really, if you're on a decent team at all, where maybe that used to be a milestone, maybe now that has to be 1,500 or so. I've heard you guys talk a little bit about that before in your other show, but
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, I think the rule changes over the years, whether it be in baseball, the type of bats you use now, you don't see the home runs you used to see at the high school level. In basketball, you play a 22 game schedule compared to a 20, and all of a sudden now a kid at the end of his career plays 10 or 12 more games. So you have these rule changes. So when you look at it, and of course, you'll hear guys in basketball that played in 1970 say, "Well, I didn't have the 3-point line," right?
Right.
And I get it. There's the rule changes as they go through these sports. I think, to me, Shayne, make it kind of hard to compare records. I think that's why, like in some sports at the professional level, like say baseball, you have a little bit more focus on the numbers and the records because theoretically the game has always been the same, right? It's same number of games, same number of innings, even though we know that, you had a steroid era and you had this and you had that. But theoretically, the game was the same. There wasn't any real changes. But I think I think in a lot of sports, it's just night and day. I mean, when you're trying to compare eras.
Well, Matt, what about you? The rules thing you mentioned is fascinating in terms of the way the way the game's officiated in football in terms of the passing game and in terms of the wide receiver advantage to the defensive back. But let me throw another one at you. What do you think about technology? You've mentioned some different things throughout the shows in season one about the equipment that's used and different things and golf that jumps out at me.
Right.
The way athletes train. You mentioned the steroids, which is obviously something that is a whole nother topic, but in terms of the bigger, faster, stronger, in terms of the way, what role would you say technology would jump in and play a particular thing, especially like you heard me in the introduction talk about a Jack versus Tiger type of thing, to compare what's going on in golf, say 20, 25 years ago compared to now. It just seems like technology's taken the game to a whole nother level, and it's opened it up to triple, quadruple, number of people who can win. Is that fair?
Well, yeah. Yeah. Well, there's no question. I mean, if you think about golf, let's just take golf for a second. Anybody that plays golf can tell you this. I mean, as a 47-year-old right now, I hit the ball just as far as I did at age 25. Now, you tell me how many sports you're just as good at 47 as you are 25. I mean, most of the time you're just not, right? But the technology has allowed players to continue. And you see it like on the PGA Tour. There's a big stink right now. Jack Nicklaus is really the guy that kind of heads this up about wanting to roll what they call roll the ball back and the clubs like basically take some of that technology you're talking about and weaken it, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it, so that and I think I'll be honest with you, I like Jack Nicklaus, always have. I think it's a bit selfish on his part because I think it's more of, he couldn't hit the ball 350 yards or whatever. Well, I mean, yeah, I think the leading guys on tour right now average like 324, 325 average, something like that. Obviously he didn't average that because he didn't have the clubs and balls that could do that. And it's almost like those guys from yesterday want these guys to have to deal with the same thing. But it's just really not realistic. So what's golf done? They've lengthened the courses, right, to try to make up for to some of these majors. You have 600-yard par fives. Didn't you tell me in one tournament there's a 700-yard par five the other day?
Well, in the match the other night, where
right,
DeChambeau and Rogers are playing Mickelson and Brady, 777 yards, I believe it was, and it was obviously a severe downhill, and the ball and the elevation there was traveling, but nonetheless, that's quite a hole. But what's fascinating about the technology is it impacts winning. It impacts,
right,
like you said, the number of people. Like when you look at the all-time list of wins, Tiger's obviously tied there at the top with like a Sam Snead. But you start going down, Matt, through even the top 50. there's not really a lot of modern day feel to it. There's so much parity in the modern day game. When you look, I think Phil Mickelson, with his big PGA win, I think maybe top 10, eighth all time, maybe something like that. And the most modern I can really get for you is probably like Vijay Singh. I don't even know in our generation if we consider Tom Watson a modern day player. Dustin Johnson, I think, is the most current player. Rory McIlroy's up there, close, right as you get into, maybe the top 20, top 30, top 35. But my point is, it just seems like when I watch tournaments today, just about every single professional that puts their tee in the ground on Thursday can win. Where
Right.
I don't know that was the case 20, 25, 30 years ago. And to me, it's fascinating that, those types of things have taken place. So I think, again, when you're talking about time period, don't you think you also have to look at competition? I mean, like when you look at the Boston Celtics winning 8 in a row in their time period, is that as impressive as the Bulls winning their 6 out of 8? Yeah, I don't know. Again, it probably depends on what age the person is you ask. But my point is that the time period and the competition and the depth of talent, I think, as we go on and on and on in the modern day, probably a little bit better. The NFL, the salary cap, and again, you're both extremes. I know, what was it, Tampa Bay Buccaneers lost like 26 games in a row. At the same time, the Miami Dolphins are still, toasting, seems like every year, right, in terms of their perfect season. So you see the extremes, but the modern day NFL game is built for parity. Don't you feel like the competition in terms of time period to time period can certainly dictate, what an individual does or what a team ends up doing?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any question that there's parity more in every sport and really at every level now. You see it even on down to high school. Really, there's a lot more parity. There's less dynasty, I guess. And where one team just always dominates. Uh, but yeah, and again, I think you mentioned it, the training. I think it allows people who really want to improve the opportunity to improve. There's just more knowledge out there. We talked about technology. I mean, in a sport you coach, Shane. I mean, take baseball. I mean,
Yeah, the
I mean, I'm
bats.
sure it's like, the bats. I mean, it's funny at the little league level even. Somebody showed me a paper the other day with home run numbers from our little league, uh, and how you know there's literally like 100 less home runs now in a season than there was maybe 10 years ago because of the types of bats being used. I know at the high school level, I can remember it just seemed like to me the league leaders would always have 8 to 10 home runs on a season, and now it seems that's more like 2 or 3 in some cases.
Mm.
Guys just aren't able to hit, because depending on who you talk to, it's like a lot of people feel like the aluminum bats used now at the high school level are more like wood almost in the way they react. So I don't know. I mean, you see that every day. I mean, do you see, I mean, think about pitching numbers. I mean, you have pitch counts now, right? I mean, how can you compare a kid's strikeout numbers from a kid today to a kid from, say, 1988 to 90 who could pitch? There was no rules. You just go out there and pitch till your arm fell off, basically. You know what I mean? How are you going to compare strikeout numbers now? There's a lot that goes into that.
Well, there's no question, and I'm glad you mentioned the different time periods and how we compare back. A lot of times I think what happens when used correctly, I think the chasing of these numbers. One thing I had in my notes, Matt, is how the chasing of numbers for the current generation can educate our current generation on previous generation. Here's what I mean by that. I don't know if you'll remember this. I would have been, gosh, I should have probably taken better notes here. I would have probably only been about 12 years old. I was a pretty big baseball fan. You were a little bit older. I can remember you kind of teaching me a little bit about what was going on in terms of Paul Molitor, with his hit streak. I learned about Joe DiMaggio through watching like Paul Molitor get to like 39 games. I can remember watching a couple games and we didn't even care about his team or anything. We just thought it was cool that, hey, this guy's hitting 25 straight, 30 straight, 35 straight, all of these different things. I think that's the type of thing that happens is you learn about Jack Nicklaus through watching Tiger Woods chase, right? I
Right.
learned about Lou Gehrig's amazing story by watching Cal Ripken. That was right around my high school days in terms of watching that streak and learning about that and doing those different things. And it helped you better understand, like, well, who's doing this in basketball? Who's doing it in football? What's the most games played? It's phenomenal to think about. So I guess, doesn't that happen a little bit in high school too? Don't you feel like, when you've been somewhere like you have, as long as you have the programs with great tradition, they kind of look back, and there's a fine line about how you want each team to have its own identity, but at the same time, you want to have an appreciation for those who had come before you. Don't you think a lot of times the Hall of Fames, the milestones, the championship banners, all those different things kind of teach a modern day society about the people who come before them? Do you kind of follow that philosophy in terms of how I kind of grew up learning about some of those things through records and milestones, and I think that's true at the high school level as well.
Well, I definitely think there's probably something to that. I mean, Shane, when you start looking at, you know, when records are on the verge of being broken, or there's some high level of success or milestone, uh, and let's just say you're a younger kid watching that. I mean, that is a way you sort of start to learn the history of the game a little bit, or like
Mhm.
you said, at the high school level, when that team has that special tournament run, it's you see the fifth and sixth grader in the stands watching that and thinking, oh, I want to be that someday. And it probably does tie a program together. We always talk about, and you said it, I mean, it is a fine line, because I think if you're not careful, you preach tradition and all this, and you take away from one particular team's ability to live in the present and just be themselves and have an identity. So I don't think you want to overdo that as a coach, but I think that um, it definitely helps for there to be a little tie into the past, so that kids kind of see who's come before them, and what's been accomplished, so that they can shoot for that as well.
Oh, I don't think there's any question. I think that a lot of times I'll see different kids in high school chasing, such and such, maybe a kills mark or an assist mark or a rebounding mark or whatever, and it gives you an opportunity to tell kids about, oh, this player did this and this player did this. I don't think there's any question. Yeah, and another thing, I just kind of have just a checklist of just some interesting topics. Is I was looking at sample size. Don't you think sample size is an interesting thing when it comes to records? Because there's certain things that, and as we get into a real fun segment here in a little bit, I'm sure it's hard to be telling where we're going to go with it. But like, there's a sample size. Sometimes a single game compared to a season, compared to a career. As you get to the higher level, I mean, high school career is 4 years, but like, you get to the higher level, a career could be 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. Isn't it kind of neat sometimes to see the different players? They're labeled as incredible players sometimes, and we think of these records as being amazing, but actually when you start to look at their career, some of them are incredible players, period. But some of them aren't. Some of them are just, like when I think of some different, people I've watched hit like 4 home runs in a game or whatever, you're talking pretty average baseball players, you know what I mean?
Right,
That
right,
didn't go on to, hitting 4 home runs in a game is one thing. Hitting like 60 in a year is another. Hitting 500 in a career is even another. And it's one of those things where the sample size is a really funny thing to look at sometimes. So like, you have a comment on that, or any examples that come to my mind? Because when I look, the home run was the first one that would come to my mind. Or every now and then you'll see an average quarterback that maybe they get behind or whatever, and they throw for like 550 yards or whatever. But
right.
are they even a top 25, 30 quarterback? And a lot of that again has to do with the game. So that was just something in my notes there I wanted to throw at you to see if you had anything that would come to mind that might bring that to light a little bit more in terms of records.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when you look at records, I think the most cherished records are records that have to do with longevity,
Mm.
you know, career records, or like you said, records that stretch over a period of time to where it's not just somebody getting hot at the right moment. It's not Scooter Gennett hitting 4 home runs, and let's face it. I mean, he's an okay baseball player. It's not, and you've seen this at the high school level. You'll see a kid who is barely an all league caliber player, hit 8 threes one night or something, break a school record. Well, I mean, because it just happened to be that night, right? A kid gets hot. And I think a lot of these individual game records or single game records, can just be the situation of right place, right time, where the records that have to do with career marks and longevity, I think, are ones that probably are a little bit better measuring stick, I guess.
Well, and they are, and a lot of times the numbers are deceiving. When you go from time period, you'll see certain lists. I in show prep today, I think I saw where like Jay Cutler has more passing yards than like Jim Kelly, Steve Young, Troy Aikman. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
If you have a big game to win, who's taking Jay Cutler over those three? Probably not.
Right.
It's one of those things where even a very talented passer like a Vinny Testaverde, who's a great thrower, more than a Joe Montana. So there's that winning factor, and there's a lot of different things. But I also kind of look at it as maybe a title for the segment would be like wrong place, wrong time, Matt. I think there's certain athletes, man. Unfortunately for them, they might have just played in the wrong year, right?
Right.
Could you imagine the arm talent of a Dan Marino in today's NFL rules? Could you imagine a Reggie Miller in terms of how acceptable it is to shoot the three ball in the NBA game today? And then I think we see it in high school. We're not that far removed where it was viewed as undisciplined if the 6'5" kid was outrunning the point, right? I mean,
Right.
we're not that far removed from that. What's your take on how some kids, I even read an interesting article about how certain left-handed hitters, Jay Bruce, we're a big Reds fan. I know Jay Bruce was one of the names that jumped out at me just because being a Reds fan, but there was others in the article that talked about how like Jay Bruce was a multi-time All-Star. He's probably a Reds
Right.
Hall of Famer. But this article talked about how the shift possibly cost him the Hall of Fame. Almost statistically cost him, if he would have played 10 to 15 years earlier, and you look at StatCast and all the different things, it was fascinating. So to me, it really is neat to see how maybe certain talent or skill sets, maybe wrong place, wrong time, or wrong air, wrong game. Does that make sense to you?
I don't think there's any question. I mean, let's take it down to the high school level, okay? Because I think there's a lot of examples at the professional level, because styles of play change. But take it to the high school level. I guarantee, if you allow your mind to go back, whoever's listening to this show, think about your favorite high school teams or whatever. I guarantee you can think back and you can find, that 6'5" kid who was told from day one that you're going to play in the post, right? And
Yeah.
don't you dare step out and shoot an outside shot. You're an inside player. Well, now you just love a big kid who can pick and pop, right, and hit that shot. I mean, you played with one in high school that was a phenomenal player, but would be even more of a phenomenal player in today's game. Okay, because
Well, he went on at the NAIA level to have a little bit
Right.
more of that stretch four as the game changed, and showcased a little bit of what you're talking about. In today's high school game, that most likely happens in the high school game.
Right, and we're talking about, for local listeners, Jason Cruz, just a phenomenal high school player, and he played for a coach who was pretty, you know, uh, free-minded in
He was,
terms of,
yeah.
he allowed Jason to play, but back then playing for him for a kid like that was step out to 15 foot and take a shot. You hardly ever seen a kid like that step behind the 3-point line. He goes to college and all of a sudden things change a little bit. But again, it's the era. It's the era that you play in. How about high school football? This, right? How many kids that had a great arm that could have thrown it all over the place, but played in 1975? Looking back, I mean, because let's face it, football at the high school level, they used to never throw the ball. I mean, every team just ran the football, right? And now these kids are, there's offenses at the high school level. There's bad football teams, okay? And you've seen it on your website. You look down through the stats and say, oh, here's a team that went 1-9 and their quarterback threw for 1,700 yards this year, right? Because it's the style of play they play in now,
right.
And so yeah, just so much of that. I think there's probably a lot of guys, my age or older, sitting here thinking, yeah, I could have done that back in high school. Was never given the chance, right? In certain sports, just because the game's changed. So there's no doubt about it. I mean, in baseball, the base stealer, who's that now? Nobody does that. I mean, at the professional level, at least. A lot analytics has changed the way people approach the game and the style of the game. There's so many different ways we could go on this, but I think the point is, it is so difficult to compare people from different eras. When you're trying to truly, if you're going to base it just off numbers or stats, take the LeBron Jordan debate, right? That's the one everybody wants to debate.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to, you could break down numbers that make LeBron the greatest player of all time. You could take numbers that make Jordan the greatest player of all time. So who is it? Well, I think it's, if you're fortunate enough to have watched both of them like we have, then you have to make your own decision based on the eye test who you think the better player was. And not everybody's going to agree on that. But my point is, if you're trying to base your argument solely on statistics, that's awfully hard to do with guys that play 20 years apart.
But Matt, isn't it easier in terms of the eye test? Going back to what you said earlier, because I just want to clarify to see if where your opinion's at on this. Don't you think it's easier with the eye test to have that Jordan, LeBron, Kobe debate compared to having that Jack Nicklaus, Tiger Woods debate because of the technology, because of the tools that they're using in their game? Is that fair? I mean, you could argue that they're playing different golf courses, longer golf courses, whatever. But to me, it's easier to make that eye test in the one because I can see their basketball skill set. Where on the other one, it's hard to compare how far they hit it, how well they putt it, how well they do all these different things.
Yeah, I think so, and I think too the three guys you just mentioned played in generally the same era. I mean, it wasn't, you know what I mean, like. TV began to take off and show NBA basketball. My point is, Jack Nicklaus probably wasn't on television the same amount of, as say a Tiger Woods was, so that people old enough to watch both those guys in their prime, maybe couldn't have watched them at the same level.
The travelers might not have always showed all 4 rounds or whatever on TV.
Right, and maybe a better way to say it would be, what about the guys that say Bill Russell or Wilt Chamberlain? Okay, well now you're so far removed from LeBron to them that very few people can remember watching both of them. I think that's where it gets really difficult. And like you said earlier too, it's the parity. Compare Tiger and Jack, who had tougher fields to go against day in, day out. I'd probably argue Tiger because the game improved and got deeper. The amount of guys who could win a tournament is deeper now than it was then, in my opinion. Some people make that same argument in the NBA, though. Some people make that argument that the NBA was more watered down either in Jordan's day, or some people say maybe now. I mean, it depends what you think in terms of who had to play against the better competition. It makes for fun debates. My only thing is it's awful hard to compare people based solely on numbers.
Well, there's no question. And speaking of numbers, let's just have fun here for a second. Let's go into if you're in the gym and you're shooting around, we always play a little make it, take it, right? I make it, you throw it back to me, let me keep shooting. What we're going to do here is I'm going to have you play a little game with me, Matt. We're going to call it break it or take it, meaning that if you think if you think the record has a chance to be broken at some point, that you would go with break it. But if not, you mean take it means that you think it's safe. You don't think it can be. And I think what we'll be able to do here is we'll be able to go back and forth at each other, tell why not. We might even be able to compare it back and forth to some sports. We might even be able to compare it to the high school game a little bit. Now, I'll even give you the option. Do you want to go first? You want me to throw one at you?
I'll have you throw one at me.
Okay.
I'll be the visitor here in the top half.
All right.
You go ahead
Well,
and
I'm going to
toss me a
start with,
softball.
obviously as a baseball coach here, and at the game's completely changed in the way analytics have decided to take small ball out of the picture, more so at the higher levels of baseball than at the lower levels. But you kind of alluded to this earlier. Rickey Henderson, let's see here, I've got the number in my notes. 1,406 steals is what I had down in my notes. That's an awfully impressive number. Now, physically possible for it to be broken someday in the for someone to break it someday in Major League Baseball for a career. What would you say?
No, no way. It's not even about physical possibility. It's about the nature of the game. I mean, it's so analytics driven. Nobody bunts. Nobody steals. It's just. I mean, let me ask you a question. Maybe you don't know this. Who was the highest active player on that list? Did you happen to catch that at all by chance? I wouldn't even know
No.
who's the active leader in stolen bases. I mean, I don't even know who
Oh
that is. I'd have to
no,
look it
I
up.
don't. Um,
But it can't even be
no, like a
approaching.
guy like, going back a little bit more into our generation, like, Alomar and some of those guys. I don't know.
Yeah,
Jose Reyes might have been up there. I'd have to look it up. It's a
yeah.
good question. But here's one that's interesting on that. Another stat about Rickey Henderson that I noticed today and looking that stat up, he also was caught 335 times. Now, I think that record's safe as well, isn't it? Because again, of what you just said, who's running 335 times in today's career? So it's just unbelievable to think about how aggressive, not just first to second, but second to third and so forth in terms of what he was able to do and in terms of the pressure on the defense. And, one of those true five-tool players in the leadoff spot, just phenomenal. And again,
Nay, not to interrupt you, I got to hit you with this though.
yeah, go
Okay,
ahead.
if I could give you 1,000 guesses as to who the current active leader in stolen bases is, and,
Okay.
and you're not getting it, okay? But it is D. Strange Gordon. All right. Okay. Now, now,
No, he's not quite as good a player as Ricky was in his day,
right
but yeah, yeah.
now, I'm sure Ricky, because Ricky called himself Ricky. Ricky is probably sitting at home tonight sweating it out a little bit because D. Strange is only 1,100 stolen bases behind Ricky Henderson
What
right
in
now.
the world?
So, I mean,
Oh, D
yeah.
strange.
So
Yeah.
if D. Strange plays till he's 76 years old,
Well, yeah. In all seriousness, what else people don't appreciate about Ricky Henderson? How many times he was able to get on? He was such a great
oh,
player, great hitter. Where even guys today that run, like I go back to maybe, and again, our generation, Matt Vince Coleman would have certainly been a guy that was a legitimate candidate to have quite a number. I don't know if you have that in front of you there still, but like, you know, it's a situation where the
Vince Coleman had 752. He was
right, and that
700
shows you
behind.
he was
Yeah,
phenomenal, right? So like, but
yeah.
again, he probably wasn't the hitter that a Lou Brock or a Ricky Henderson would have been, right? So it's
Right, right.
it's that's kind of interesting as well. All right, your turn. You throw one at me here.
All right. Well, baseball's the one we got a lot of them in. I'll go a baseball, and then I'll try to hit another sport. It just seems like baseball records are more sacred for some reason. I don't know. I don't know if that's fair or not.
I think
Right.
it is.
Okay. So obviously, uh, no one's ever going to win 511 games against a
No,
pitcher. Okay, we
no,
know that. Cy
no.
Young did that.
Yeah.
So let's make it a little tougher. Does does anybody win 300 games again? Now, right now, to give you an idea, the highest active player is Justin Verlander at 226. So he's 74 wins away from 300. He's, I think, like 38 years old. Um, does anybody win 300 games again? Now, keep it, you got 5-man rotations now. Pitchers aren't allowed to throw more than 100 pitches, 6 innings
Yeah.
or so.
Yeah.
Um,
I would say no. I would say some of your really elite guys, like the numbers you're kind of talking about there, some of your elite guys, 200, 250. I would say no, not humanly impossible, but I would say no because of all the factors that have to go in. I think this is the other thing that's fascinating about records. Sometimes it's not just you winning in a baseball game as a pitcher. You're at the mercy of your manager letting you stay in. Again, as you said, I'm seeing more and more starters, good starters, being taken from the game fifth, sixth inning in the National League, being hit for and so forth. The matchups, the analytics say not to let the guy go through the third time.
Right.
I'm guessing back in the day, Nolan Ryan didn't care if he was facing the lineup the fourth time. You know what I mean? Like it was one of those where, so Verlander, some of those guys, Max Scherzer, some of those guys you're talking about, they probably have been given a little longer rope. But even then, in today's time, Matt, that means what? 115 pitches, 120 pitches, 6-7 innings. So you're at the mercy of your bullpen. You're at the mercy of a lot of those things. So it's I would say I'd say even 250 is pushing it. I can't imagine 300 being possible. And impossible maybe a strong word, but I would say no if I had to put the money on it.
Yeah, I would kind of agree with that. I mean, certainly not impossible, but I don't see anybody on the horizon getting that done.
All right, let's take a look here. This is one that's fascinating because I don't think I appreciate just how good Jerry Rice was. 22,895 receiving yards. And I would ask you because, we agree that the passing and some of those different things should be more and more and more, yet the record seems so untouchable. Can you paint a picture for me where in our lifetime someone ends up being better than Jerry Rice in terms of receiving yards?
Wow, that's a good one. I mean, looking at the list, um, the next best was actually the number 2 guy is active, and Larry Fitzgerald.
Fitzgerald, yeah.
He's still 5,000 yards behind, and obviously as good as he's been, he's getting up in years. I don't know. Man, that's interesting. What makes that an interesting one is because the game is changing to where you're throwing it so
should be throwing
much.
more. But now, do you think nowadays, these elite quarterbacks have 5 wide, where back in the day, we were joking about, the 1970 quarterback or whatever used to have 2 wide receivers, right?
Right.
You might occasionally sneak a tight end out there or whatever. You think it's just the ball's going to spread around more nowadays? Is that why?
Yeah, that's the thing. You're going to more there's going to be more targets to other people who aren't necessarily your number 1 option. And it seems to like, careers aren't as long in some cases. Man, I don't know. I'm going to say, I hate to say never on that one. So I guess I'll say break it on that one. It may take a long, long time, but maybe somebody gets that done. I mean, I think that I'll be honest with you. I still think it's a long shot, but I just don't think I wouldn't put it in the impossible category.
Matt, don't you think too that like this is something for high school coaches and kids to understand that like a lot of times these milestones can simply be impacted by team first. And it may just not be, again, you may not be playing in the right time or place for that to be the case. You may be more about team. I know in your program, you've coached some phenomenal kids that never got to 1,000 points. Why? Well, because they might have been waiting their turn behind great players. Maybe they didn't truly become option 1 or 2 to their junior year. You've coached some phenomenal 750, 800 point scores, right? So it's one of those things where I've seen other kids go on to score 1,200, 1,300 points at certain schools, boys or girls that, they were obviously good players. They wouldn't have scored that, but maybe not quite as good as some of those 700 or 800 point scores. So don't you think there's something to be learned there in terms of about there's 1 ball to go around. The quarterback gets 1 ball on every snap. There's 1 basketball for 5 people to share. And sometimes when you're on these really elite teams, some of these milestone or these records may not be in the cards for you.
Yeah, well, right. But I do think too, the one positive about being on elite teams is maybe you play a few more games because you go a little deeper in your playoff run or tournament run.
Sure.
I don't know, but I don't know which one of those evens out more. But yeah, but I agree with what you're saying. It's sometimes when you're playing alongside of a lot of talent, you have to share it a little bit. So, yeah, that's a tough one. That was a really good one with the receiver. I don't think it's likely to be broken, but I hate to put it in the impossible. I'm not going to put it in there with like Cy Young's 511 wins, which is like, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but
right.
Let me hit you with one here. Let's go. Let's take golf. We'll do a golf one. Obviously, the talk's always been about Tiger chasing Jack's record and all that, the 18 majors. But I'll give you this one. Tiger and Sam Snead are tied with the most tour wins of all time at 82 wins. Does anybody ever touch that record? Does any one golfer ever win 82?
I would think I would take that record as being safe, and again, the reason I would say that is from the fact of I think what Tiger Woods has done, and I think we're seeing it right before our eyes. I know I'm a bigger, PGA fan week to week than some people. I think a lot of golf fans will tune in the 4 times a year in the majors. I'm probably one that's more week to week, a passionate fan. But I think what he has done is he has created a generation that watched him play,
Right.
that has taken off the depth. I mean, the number of 15, 20 stars on the PGA right now in their 20s or early 30s is unbelievable. The amount of people who can win, to win multiple times in a year is unbelievable. To win 3 or 4 is almost unheard of. And even like a Dustin Johnson, I think, Matt, if you go back to, gosh, I don't have it in front of me. Like if you go back to like 2007 or 8, I think there's only 1 year that he hasn't won at least one time. That's really, really good. But I think on the all-time list, I had that here somewhere, I think. I think he's tied for 26th all time. He's 34 years old. You know what I mean? So like he's got, Phil Mickelson, 45 wins. Not even barely over halfway there. So to me, the number of times plus what's happening is people have watched physically what's happened to Tiger. And I've heard Rory say things about how, like, man, sometimes not to sound non-competitive, but sometimes you got to be careful grinding out every single, Friday round to make a cut, or you'll hear Brooks Koepka say, man, I don't quite prepare or get jacked up for a lot of these other tournaments like I try to gear up for the majors and so forth. So obviously when you win 82, it's got to be about giving yourself a chance every week, right? I mean, you're talking about, if your golf prime puts you in about a 20, 25 year window, you've got to get yourself up around that 3 to 5 wins a year. I mean, that's something.
It just doesn't happen a lot anymore, for sure.
No,
just because
it doesn't.
Of the parity.
You're right. So I think that's safe. But again, going back to what my reason would be, is I think it's the culture that Tiger Woods has created with the stars in their 20 somethings. It's unbelievable how many good players are ready for the biggest stage right now. Right. I want to go back to baseball. I think this one, I'm trying to throw ones at you that really are on, in my opinion, are like right on the brain. Like this one's really impressive. Hank Wilson, 191 RBIs in a season. So I mean, basically, you're getting an RBI every night, but then you're getting 30 more. You know what I mean? It's one of those where I'm fascinated by this because, again, I think you could go a lot of different ways. I mean, we've had some guys get, I know we've had some guys get the 100 at the All-Star break, and gosh, I don't remember. I see Gonzalez, I think, was one. Cabrera might have been at 165. Manny Ramirez, maybe 165, maybe it was. But like, that's still quite a distance away. Is 191 in terms of knocking them in? Is that doable someday in the game of baseball with the smaller ballparks? And in the way offense seems to be coming on?
Wow, that's a good one. Because I'll tell you why it's a good one. I think records, it's like we talked about with longevity, right? Like career records. I think it's almost easier to predict whether a career record is safe. Okay. What's tough is, can somebody get hot for a shorter period of time, like one season, and do something just crazy? Because I know it's easy to sit here and say, "Oh, that'll never be touched." But how many years did we say nobody will ever hit 61 home runs? And then all of a sudden that
That's
fell,
right.
and it fell a couple times, and so, man,
Well, it kind of when someone does it, I think again it's that expectation or that bar of like, well, wait a minute, they did it. What if I can do it? You know what I mean?
right, right. But I will say, I'm going to say I will say that is unbreakable. I'm going to say it's not going to be broken for various reasons. You mentioned some earlier. There's these guys now late in the game are going to face left-handed specialists if they're a left-handed hitter. Uh, they're never going to see a pitcher more than probably twice a game, or well, very seldom more than three times a game anyway. You're going to see some, and these guys coming out of the bullpens now, are throwing 99, 100 mile an hour.
Sure.
It's really difficult, I think. Plus, guys now too, I think, you have scheduled days off. You usually have some games you're not going to play. Just a lot of different things go into that. I'll say I'm gonna say that one's safe.
I love the team aspect too. I mean, you've obviously throughout the course of the year have to have some really good on base people in front of you. You've got to be protected in the order behind you. Yeah, there's a lot of factors there that go into that. That's good. Well, Matt, I know we don't want to run forever here. We can do a couple more. You throw one more at me, and then if we want to rattle some off just to share them, we can, and then we'll close things out here.
Yeah, I mean, we could go on and on forever. We don't want to do that. Uh, Here's a football one. Most rushing yards all time. Right. So right now that's 18,355. Right. That's Emmitt Smith. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, 18,355. The next highest active player would be Frank Gore at 16,000. So you're talking 2,300 yards behind. Um, there's obviously, you're in a day and age where the ball gets thrown around more. We talked about that. What's your take on that? Will running back ever eclipse that number?
Well, it would have to be sooner, or I don't think it can be later. Just
it would be
because
like Frank Gore's at 16,000. I think Adrian Peterson's fourth on the list, but he's down another maybe 1,500 after that. I mean, you're talking about guys getting late in their careers.
Right. And how many, it seems like the way they're going with the running back now is it's better to have two or three. The carries get split. You usually have that 3 to 5 year window, and you start to see a big fall off. It's hard to stay healthy. And again, like you said, I always get a kick out of the run pass option because, when you're telling someone the talent level and the confidence level of Aaron Rodgers, like, hey, do you think it's open? Well, yeah, I think it's open. You know what I mean?
Right,
how many times you started, what I'm saying? Like, when you have that type of talent and you have these types of guys, I'm guessing that, they look at that window and they're like, yeah, I can make that throw. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's one of those where, yes, I think I won't say it's humanly impossible. It's not an impossible, but again, I think it's one of those things in terms of the direction of where the game is going. I think that's safe. So,
yeah.
It's fun. We could go back and forth. I was looking at my list. I think we've touched on the Kyle Ripken, Brett Favre, 305 interceptions. I laughed at that one. I think kind of going the other way with records.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm not a hockey fan, but like research Wayne Gretzky sometime, and it's like he was playing a completely different sport. I mean, was talking about 9 MVPs. He had more assists than other players had points. Like, I mean, he has
Hey,
2,857 points. It's not even the same sport.
well, it's funny, we've sat here talking about records, but sometimes don't you just hear a stat that blows your mind?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I've heard stats on Greg Maddux before about how many times he even went to a 3-ball count
Oh
in his
yeah, yeah.
career and stuff like that. But here's one, Shane. I had to just bust out laughing when a friend of mine, my assistant coach, NJ Kite, I'll give him some credit, hit me with this one. But Ray Allen, right? Take Ray Allen. Great shooter. Would anybody argue that? I mean, one of the best 3-point shooters of all time.
No question.
Okay. We are watching, though, in Steph Curry, somebody at a different level in shooting the basketball. Now, here's one for you. Steph Curry could go 0 for his next 536 threes and have a higher shooting percentage than Ray Allen. Now, let that one sink in for a second. And I'm pretty sure Steph's going to knock one or two of those down out of his next 500. You know what I mean? I mean, think about that. He could go 0 for his next 500 and have a better percentage. I mean, what's that tell you now? That tells you how many threes are we shooting now, okay, in today's game, where the attempts are that high, but also obviously a clip that he's making them at. And I think it's cool sometimes. And what's great about sports is you sometimes you think I'm watching the greatest there ever was, right? And sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong. You know what I mean? It's like we grew up in an era. I always said this. I feel fortunate to have grown up in an era where maybe we've watched the best athlete in almost every sport ever play the game. I mean, you could make the argument either LeBron or Michael Jordan, right? We grew up and watched both those guys play. Gretzky, I don't even think it's close. Tiger or Jack, either one, right? You start looking at obviously sports like baseball and football get a little
Tom Brady,
because
Jerry Rice, those types of guys.
You've got to break it down a little further than that. But when you watch a guy like Steph Curry and say, gosh, it's pretty hard to argue he's the greatest shooter that's ever lived at this point. I don't know how just pure shooter, it's kind of hard to argue that. But
no, it is. And I think sometimes, do you remember last year in season 1, we did an old school, new school. And when we kept score throughout the night on that show, it was pretty even, right? And, like I'm watching Chris Paul right now chase history in the NBA Finals, and they're talking about what this one final piece of the puzzle could do for his legacy. Well, here's one in terms of one of my favorite players that I think's maybe one of the top 5 most underappreciated players in the history of the NBA. Chris Paul has 10,270 some assists right now. John Stockton had 15,806.
Right.
Still number 1. You know what I'm saying? Like can you imagine John Stockton in a time where, like today, the point guard dominates the ball? Again, I mentioned earlier, I learn, and people today learn about Oscar Robertson through Russell Westbrook's triple-double chase. And so it's so cool how when people start chasing, territory that people thought would never be touched, you learn about the greatness of those who had become before. So, I look down the Nolan Ryan 7 no-hitters. That's ridiculous.
Or the strikeouts. Nobody will ever touch 5,000 or whatever strikeouts.
No. And again, that's even in a day where, no one cares about striking out. Some players do it a couple times a night just because they think they're supposed to.
Yeah, it's like guys aren't shortening their swings though too. Nobody's going to touch 5,000, right? Yeah. I think Rickey's record's never going to be broke. Pete Rose's record, Pujols is 1,000 hits behind Pete Rose right now. I don't see that record ever falling.
Yes.
The 56-game hit streak, who knows? I guess it could happen, right? Well,
again, couldn't that even be? I mean, you'd expect it to be a pretty good hitter, but couldn't that just be kind of your everyday major league player someday? Now, I don't think they get to 56, but again, some pretty solid players can get to 30, 35, 40, and you never know, I guess. But it's you mentioned it earlier, the shift.
Right.
The specialist, all of these different things. And a 4 at bat night, man, it's just harder to get a hit sometimes. It really is.
Yeah.
So I guess my notes are clear. We always
Yeah.
like to do a final thought. I'll let you go first, Matt, and then I'll close us out. What do we kind of take? Obviously, this is kind of a fun twist to the show, but as always, we kind of get a little leadership and a little coaching philosophy out of it. Kind of close us out here with a thought in terms of what people should take away from it.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a ton to take away from it. I mean, we did it a lot for fun, but I think there's probably a little bit to take away from it from a leadership or coaching standpoint, from the standpoint of helping manage those expectations, understanding that, there are going to be kids chasing milestones or records, and in their mind, they're important, in their parents' mind, they're important. And I think you got to try to, help, I guess, juggle those individual wants and desires with the team aspect of it. And I think too, I think what we learned from this discussion is you got to be careful when you compare people from different eras. I mean, it's so easy to say, well, so and so. I've heard this before. Well, so and so couldn't play in today's NBA. Well, okay. Why do you say that? Well, look at him. Look physically at him. You see the old videos. Okay, well, if that person was playing today, you don't think they'd be in the weight room? They'd be doing the nutrition.
Right.
It wasn't around back then.
Right.
I mean, so I don't buy that. I think that we got to be careful when we're comparing generations just to automatically rule people out or say, well, look at this proves somebody with that.
Like people say, Charles Barkley, they think of the guy they see on TNT, and I'm like, hey, you might want to roll back that '93 finals film and watch just how good he was. I mean,
right. Well, that's what I'm saying. Or they'll say, Bob Cousy, he's skinny. I mean, if these guys had the same access to training and nutrition as these guys do now, they'd look the same as these guys do now. I mean, it's
right.
So, but no, I think that's the thing to take away from it is just sometimes the comparisons. I think you got to be careful when you're comparing generations.
I was jotting down some notes here, and I think that's really well said. I think the thing to learn, what I take from it, and I'm lucky enough to even coach some kids going through this right now in baseball and in basketball, where they're chasing different milestones and different things, county records, and season records. But then as they go on, once you get a season record, you're kind of in line for career records and so forth. And I think what I learned, Matt, is to teach them to be humble, to respect those who have come before, respect the game, respect their history, use it as the motivation to go, always do it within the team concept. And as a coach, I think we have a responsibility to our kids when they work hard to help them reach individual goals, but to do so within a team format and to understand that sometimes you may have to make decisions. Sometimes it may not be right to leave that kid in, right? If the school record is 47 points and he or she has 44 and there's a minute to go in the game and you're up 50, you know what I mean? Like, that's a hard balance, right? I'm sure you've been there before as a coach in terms of that uncomfortable feeling and how it goes about. So it's those things on how you balance all of those things in terms of helping kids, but always doing it so in the team format. And I think that if you always do it that way, then I think you'll find a good balance of the individual and team. So again, a lot of fun. Love to hear from people. Check us out on Twitter, Facebook. Let us know some of your favorite records, some of the records maybe we missed tonight. Leave us a comment there if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're not, you can go over to YouTube, SVC Sports Zone Shayne. If you're watching us and you don't have us yet on your podcast app, make sure you get that as well. So if you're driving, you can get us on your phone there, iTunes, iHeart, Spotify. We're on all of those out there. So again, can't thank you enough for all the support. So Matt, on that note, we're going to get on out here and put a capper on show 32, our second show here in season 2. And look forward to getting back at it next week and doing it again. So on that note, appreciate everybody, and we'll talk to you next week.